Hi everyone, welcome to Community Classroom and History on Trial. This is Dr. Tracy McCarthy. We're going to be talking about Corona and common sense. And what we're going to be doing is looking at some statistics and some dynamics related to the statistics surrounding Corona. And so we're going to be questioning some of these statistics and also looking at the importance of freedom of inquiry. Looking at how important it is to make sure that you have both valid and reliable data that you can depend on in terms of guiding thinking in science and guiding thinking in terms of diagnostic reliability also. And so we're also going to touch on this idea of the structure of scientific revolutions and why it is so important to analyze data and also to formulate new hypotheses along the way and explore those things. And so we are looking at, why it's so important to inquire and why it's so important to clarify things in science so that you do have this progression in thinking and a better situational understanding. Because right now things are pretty much all over the place, and you will see this when we're just going to look at some really basic stats related to Corona, and we're going to look at how this disparity creates a lot of confusion and why you do need to get to a point where you do have some valid and reliable stats so that you can progress in terms of thinking. And it might help to understand why people are sort of all over the place with trying to understand what is going on with this particular dynamic. And as always, if this appears on anything other than Dr. Tracy McCarthy, it is stolen and unauthorized. Let's get started. Now we're going to quickly just review this executive order that talks about the importance of freedom of inquiry. Freedom of inquiry appears to be under siege right now. That's the perspective that many people have. That is the experience that many people have related to sort of free and open debate about a number of things. And one of the problems that this executive order points out, and this is a year-old executive order, so it's from back in 2019, back in March. But one of the things that it points out is that when you don't have that freedom of inquiry, when you can't challenge data, when you can't reconsider data, when you can't analyze data freely and discuss these competing opinions, you stifle learning and you stifle scientific discovery. And so when you're talking about something scientific, it's very important that you do not stifle these competing voices, that you remain open to a variety of voices, a variety of perspectives, a variety of vantage points. Because when you don't do that, you stifle beneficial research, and then learning overall becomes undermined, and you also have a dumbing down of people. Now, what we're going to do is just touch on Thomas Kuhn's theory of scientific revolutions. If you have not read Thomas Kuhn's book, you could at least just look at the theory. You can pull the stuff up online and get an idea of how he viewed this progression of shifting science and going from one vantage point or one way of looking at the world to having a shift in paradigm and looking at the world in another way, and then having this new paradigm, this new model for thinking about the world. And that's very important in science. That's how science progresses. That's actually how we progress, period. We have one way of looking at the world. We have some experiences. Those experiences change our vantage points. And then we progress with a new way of looking at the world based upon that experience, based upon assimilating information and experiences and accommodating that. And so it is important to understand Thomas Kuhn's theory when we're talking about Corona and common sense, and understanding where things are going and where things should be going, not just with Corona and common sense, but with science, period, and just with understanding the world. Now what we're going to do now is we're going to look at some statistics. So we're going to start off looking at these basic statistics, and then we're going to address the issue of discrepancies related to the statistics. And this is very important because in theory, the basic data should be consistent. And so in terms of those basic numbers, you should see consistency across context and across sources, but that is not what is going on. And so you're going to see where there is this vast discrepancy. And so the CDC should in theory be this central repository for the data. And so other sources should be drawing from this. But what is seen is that other sources are apparently calculating things in a different way, or they are getting their information from other sources, or they are understanding the information in a variety of ways. And so that creates a problem in terms of reliability. And because you're talking about clinical dynamics, there should be case formulations where you have specific criteria that are depended on in terms of understanding what is going on. But what you'll see is that sources, people are sort of all over the place in terms of how they are understanding the dynamics, in terms of how they are diagnosing dynamics, in terms of how they are researching the dynamics. And so it is important to look at this and to get a better understanding of why these discrepancies exist, and also start to look at how to close these gaps so that you do have consistent data that makes sense across time, because the gaps are huge and there are lots of implications for these gaps in terms of this data, these numbers, and you're going to see that as we go along. And here you can see this is the most recent update, and you can see the numbers in bold, and you can see some of the numbers have changed. And you can also see the top number for mortality being at 56,000. Now we're going to look at where the CDC is getting the information from and how they are calculating these numbers, what they are calling provisional death count. And so they do see their format as the format for getting the most complete and accurate picture. Now, they get the information from the death certificates from the various states and the District of Columbia. Now, one of the things that you might want to consider is this dynamic of probable and presumed cause, because they are including that. And in these numbers, they are also including individuals who may or may not have laboratory confirmation in terms of this diagnosis. So this really complicates things when you are diagnosing something very specific. You are identifying a specific microbe. However, you don't have the laboratory confirmation for it. And so that becomes a problem in terms of research and in terms of understanding exactly what is going on. And here you have additional information about why these numbers are different. And so one of the things that the CDC points out is that death certificates take time to complete, and for some reason there is this perception that it takes extra time to code these specific mortality dynamics, because these have to be done by hand, and it takes basically a week to do this by hand, which then brings into question, where are these daily tallies coming from when they are saying, you know, this many people contracted it, this many people tested positive, this many people died from it. And so it's confusing where all of this is coming from in terms of these daily tallies when the CDC is indicating that these numbers are not coming to them that quickly. And so, you know, you have the question of where are these other sources getting their information from, and that's not completely clear. Now we're going to quickly look at these discrepancies that we were talking about. And so you can see here we're going to look at some data from Johns Hopkins, and we're going to also look at some of the World Health Organization data, and you're going to see discrepancies all over the place here. So this data is taken from May the 12th. So remember, you had the CDC data for May the 12th, and now we're going to look at this data for May the 12th. And so what you see is very interesting here. You see Johns Hopkins with this very elevated number of 80,000. This is the same date that you have data in the 50,000 range for the CDC. And then you also see where the World Health Organization is reporting 78,000, which is much closer to the Johns Hopkins data. What's interesting about that is that the WHO, World Health Organization, identifies the data as coming from national authorities. And so it's unclear who the national authorities are, because the data from the CDC for the same time frame is significantly behind this. So the CDC is not reporting numbers this high. And so it would be important to find out exactly where they are getting the data from and why this data is so different across context. Because again, in theory, the CDC should be having that formal working data in terms of the statistics for the mortality and for the incidence. And so again, you see Johns Hopkins has this really high number of 80,000 on the 12th, and then you see WHO having 78,000 at the same time that the CDC is reporting only 51,000. And so again, it is important to have some validity and reliability in terms of these numbers, and that is not the case at this point in time. And so it creates a problem across the board, not just for scientists, but for the public, in terms of the public having some sense of understanding about what is going on. And we're also going to look at some of the Louisiana stats because they have been prominent in the news related to the incidence and the mortality. One of the things, and this is for the same time period, and so Louisiana during this time period was reporting 2,281 in terms of mortality for that same date. And then there's an indication of 66 probable. Also, you have information about the tests that have been performed by the state lab and by commercial labs. One of the interesting things is that you also have this problem with reliability, because there are different tests being performed. You have tests being performed in different contexts. You have different assessments being made related to the test, and you have tests looking for different things. And so there is not consistency in terms of the methodology and also in terms of what is being pursued in terms of information. And here you can see with the most recent update that the numbers have changed. The numbers are going up, but the number in terms of probable down below, that number has remained the same. Now, one thing that is important to remember is as more tests are performed, the numbers are going to go up. And so some people are becoming alarmed by the numbers going up in terms of the cases reported. But if you have a huge push to test more people, then you're going to have more positives. It just goes hand in hand. You can't get away from that. And so if you have a country that is not doing, or a state that is not doing as much testing, they are not going to have the numbers that are going to be as high. And so that's another confusing thing, because if you don't have the same rate in terms of the assessment process, you are not going to have real clarity about what is going on. This is not to say that there needs to be a push for more testing or a push for less testing. This is simply suggesting that people should consider the reality that If you test more people, you're probably going to come up with more positives. And so your numbers are going to look higher. And so it's actually possible that the United States may not have the highest numbers, but if the United States is doing more testing, the United States is going to present as having higher numbers. And so we really don't have clarity because the numbers can change from moment to moment in terms of who may or may not test positive around the world. And so in some places where you have low numbers, you may just simply have low testing going on. And so again, that problem with accuracy and what is being presented as truth. And so we may not have access to the truth for a number of reasons. And we are looking at some of these reasons, and these issues need to be cleaned up. And here you have Louisiana pointing out that the information that they have is as timely and accurate as complete as it can possibly be for them, and that the data may change as they learn more. And so this also complicates things because, again, it is really important to have that solid case formulation so that the information is valid and reliable. And there's another interesting notation because there's a little map, and on the map they have the points on the map showing where the numbers are supposed to be higher, and then you have this caveat that says points on the map do not represent the actual location of cases or deaths. So that may be misleading, and it's unclear the extent to which that is misleading. And so they also point out some other places where you can get information related to corona. Now, one thing that really stands out here in terms of Louisiana discussing this is this notation that the CDC no longer requires that positive test results be confirmed. And so that also creates a problem in terms of validity and reliability in terms of this data. An additional notation that Louisiana has is information related to people who recover and how they presume recovery has taken place or when it has taken place. And so one of the things missing from a lot of the conversations, one thing missing is this information related to recovery. So there is a lot of information about people going into the hospital and also people not recovering, but there should be significant attention paid to individuals who are recovering and what that looks like. And so that is missing from the conversation, and there may be a number of reasons for that, but there needs to be a focus on the people that have recovered and how they have recovered, why they may have recovered, and how recovery is being defined. Louisiana also provides additional information related to demographics, specifically related to race and ethnicity. And so there has been a growing focus on race and ethnicity related to this dynamic. Now, Louisiana has a high diversity in terms of cultural diversity, but that's not being manifested in terms of these numbers. And so there is this high focus on individuals who have been identified as Black and individuals who've been identified as white. What would be helpful in this instance would be having more information related to that mitochondrial DNA. What is the ancestral heritage of the individuals in terms of mortality, in terms of susceptibility, in terms of resilience? Where are the individuals coming from in terms of ethnicity, in terms of ancestry? Also for males, what types of males are we talking about when we're talking about Black and white? What is the ancestral narrative for their groups? And so it would be helpful to have that type of information, and particularly since the testing often resembles DNA testing anyway. And so it might be beneficial and more meaningful to have that information, that very specific information. And one of the reasons why this is really important is because there has been this focus on, this growing focus on identifying those individuals who would be, considered quote unquote black, there has been a growing focus on suggesting that these individuals are the face of this dynamic, which is really odd given the fact that when you look at the continent of Africa, there is not a similar dynamic going on. Or when you look at other spaces where you have people who are identified as quote unquote black, so brown people. And so you don't have that dynamic going on. And so it's a little odd that you would have this entire globe and this very, very specific, discrete group of people in one country and in certain parts of the country being identified as overrepresented in terms of the entire world. And so that definitely is begging for a little bit more attention to get a better understanding of what exactly is going on there. And this is particularly the case because we've talked about this before in terms of ancestry and people who are considered foundational Black Americans, African Americans, Brown Americans. We've talked about this before in terms of this particular group of people having a health background that varies from the individuals that they purportedly came from. Which would be a number of groups in Africa. And so you have these different health profiles, and the difference does not make clear sense. It's not, just readily understandable. And so you also have a dynamic whereby some of the manifestations of this disease, of this microbe, these manifestations really resemble lupus. And so it's very important, again, to look more clearly at what is actually going on, because, again, if you recall from those discussions, lupus is not the problem in Africa that it is in the Americas. And so you have a dynamic where a lot of these symptoms that are being discussed related to corona, they really resemble these autoimmune dynamics. And autoimmune dynamics are highly related to individuals who are brown and who are in the Americas. Now, as we wrap this up, we have discussed this dynamic of freedom of inquiry and why that is so important and why you need to have very solid information. When you're talking about something as important as this, you need to have really solid information and you need to have consistent information. You need to have valid and reliable data so that you can make appropriate inferences about what is going on. And right now, that's not what is going on. And in fact, you have a dynamic where people are being discouraged in terms of critically looking at the information so that people can have a better situational understanding. And that's a problem. When you're talking about science, that's a problem. And so you should have everyone looking at this critically, not just scientists, and not just policymakers, but the general public should be looking at this more critically. Medical doctors, nurses, healthcare professionals need to be looking at this more critically. Patients need to be looking at this more critically. And so hopefully this has provided food for thought so that people can start to look for and insist upon valid and reliable and consistent data across contexts. Remember, knowledge is power. Take care. See you soon.